there was like a few different origin points. One was like right around the time that I was done with my first book, I started doing research into the Russian Revolution, and I was in Mexico City and I visited Trotsky's house. And I didn't exactly know like what aspect or what angle I wanted to.
Wait, I just have to interrupt. Trotsky had a house in Mexico City.
Yeah, when he escaped the Soviet Union, since the Bolsheviks turned on him, he ran away to Mexico and he was killed. But he did have a house there, and like it's a historical, like it's historically preserved. You know, you can like see his room and like the objects that were in his room and all of that, which was really cool because I think like when you're writing historical stuff about a time period you didn't live through, it's very intimidating, especially if you know, like can't really quite picture what the world was like what objects people were interacting with and stuff like that. So anyway, I didn't end up really writing about Trotsky, but it did sort of plant a seed. So there was that. And then there was this other thing involving my grandmother leaving me her memoirs. And they were she had actually like learned to type specifically so that she could type them up and give them to me. And she gave them to me like when I was maybe in high school. And I had them for years sitting on my computer. And I did not open the file until the night of her funeral. And I started reading them, and I started also translating them because my daughter, I thought, might one day want to read them, and they're in Russian. Um, and then, like, as I was translating them, I was like also making these sort of notes in the margins and kind of annotating it. And then it started to feel like I was having a conversation with her um, after she was dead, you know. And my book, it's about a person talking to their great grandmother who's a ghost. So, like, I didn't, you know, like I made it like a physical sort of manifestation of the process that I was going through. So I was like looking at these memoirs, reading them, and I was thinking a lot about like why had I put off reading them for so long? Because I was always interested in her life. I was always curious, but like there was almost like a psychological block I felt at the idea of just like, oh, it's going to be really heavy and I'm going to have to take it on. And then it'll be like this burden that I have to carry. And I just resisted it, you know, until after she died. And then it was like very clear reading them, like, oh, I've already been carrying this burden. You know, this isn't something that like I knew or I could point to, but it was just always there. This feeling of like fear, hypervigilance, these things that like I had inherited without even really understanding.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I was reading an interview that you did, and you were talking about like intergenerational trauma and the sort of melding between mothers and daughters that happens, especially in childhood, and how intense those relationships can be, and how you can take on certain behavior patterns or assume certain quirks that are passed down that you're mirroring. I don't know, but you were talking about being on a plane flying to a writer's residency in Wyoming. And as the plane was descending or ascending, you were kind of flying over the mountains and you found yourself kind of panicking. And then you realized that you are not actually afraid of flying. It's your mother, but you were somehow like acting out her fear on her behalf, even though she wasn't there.
Yeah, isn't that wild to like, because I feel like it was one of those things where just like in the moment I had that realization and the fear was just gone. And I feel like that kind of stuff doesn't happen very often, you know, where you can like literally trace something back and be like, oh, this is not mine. This is someone else's and it's been like handed to me and I don't want it and I'm done. Thank you.
Well, but I think intergenerational trauma it's actually a fairly common theme in the fiction that I read or have been reading. And it's a curious thing because I think we all have it in some way, shape, or form. And
Absolutely.
because being alive is traumatic. And What's interesting is that we sort of feel it, but it's hard to define it. We know it's there, but we don't know exactly where it is or even what it is until maybe we read our grandmother's memoirs and it starts to click into focus. Like, oh yeah, all of this hypervigilance, like who wouldn't be hypervigilant if they lived through X, Y, and Z? Or
Right. It's like a combination of, epigenetics, like being passed down to you, like literally in your genes and just also in your upbringing, because those are the people that brought up the people who brought you up, So it's just um, like an inevitable, like, of course, you're going to be influenced by the people who came before you.
yeah, but just in maybe ways that are deeper and more mysterious than we
Oh, yeah.
realize. Like it's not even stuff that has to be communicated. It's just stuff that's like there in your blood. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it was so interesting reading my grandmother's memoirs because she was not, she wasn't a writer. She was like a chemical engineer. And she, like the kinds of details that she would notice would be so weird. And they're also exactly the kinds of details that I would notice. And I think they do stem from that like hyper vigilance. And then like the things that weren't in her book were also very strange because like, the amount of space she gave like to meeting my grandfather, like them falling in love, like all of that took up less space in this book than like her worrying about my dad's like constipation in summer camp. And it's like, it's just like it's so like like that's such a particular point of view, in terms of like concerns, interests. It's like I mean, I guess the other thing that I think about a lot is like everyone has their like biases or the filter through which they see the world. And when you come across a filter that's like so clearly defined and different than your own filter, you become really aware of it.
Well, yeah. And I think before we get any further, just so that listeners are oriented, I want to like just give the basic setup of your novel. Like I'll take a stab at it and then you can correct me or rejoin with additional details. But your book opens with a young woman named Genia getting pregnant by her husband, Ben. And they had both expressed a desire to never have children, maybe him in particular, but they weren't planning on a child. This is an accidental pregnancy. And she decides she wants to keep the baby. There isn't really much of a debate. She just sort of, by the time she discovers it, she just considers it a child growing in her womb and she wants to have the baby. At the same time, her beloved grandmother, Vera, is dying back east. Ben and Genia live in Los Angeles. She has a warm but like somewhat complicated relationship with her mother. Is that a fair way to define it? I don't know if that's the way you would define it.
I think it gets warmer as the book goes on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that's kind. And then, of course, there's the issue of Paul, the psychic medium, and Irina, the great great grandmother, who is dead but begins to communicate with Genia via this medium. This is where the book sort of spirals off into the supernatural, and through these conversations that she has, that Genia has with Paul, the psychic medium, who is channeling her great grandmother, we get, in essence, the memoir of Irina, or at least the slice of her life that she so deeply needs to express from the beyond. Is that fair? Did I get it mostly right?
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay,
I
okay.
think another thing I would maybe add is that, like, at the beginning of the book, Zhenya, she came out to LA to become an actress, but it wasn't really her dream exactly. And she's pretty, like, stuck, I would say. She's working as a medical translator. She's not really connected to her own desires. And it's through making this big decision to keep her pregnancy and then also talking to her great grandmother and like really hearing her story that Zhenya is able to kind of get unstuck and become more connected with her desires. And it's like a coming of age story in a lot of ways too.
So, like from a writerly perspective, as I was reading your book, and as the book gets into these more supernatural sections and the conceit of this psychic medium channeling the great great grandmother uh, comes to the fore, I was thinking about the work that you were doing in the composition of this novel and trying to figure out a way to bring the generations together. Like, can you talk a little bit about the creative choice to use a psychic medium? Have you visited psychic media before? Is that the right way to use plural? Psychic media?
Um, I don't know what the plural of medium is. Yeah, maybe. I um I took mediumship classes actually to as research for the book. But I was thinking like, okay, I want to tell a multi-generational story, but I want it to also feel like concentrated, you know? Like I don't want that sprawling feeling. I want it to feel like time stacked up inside of itself because that's often how it feels, like how time feels, I think, of like everything kind of happening at the same time inside of us, like a, like the metaphor of the nesting doll or whatever. That's the title of the book. So, and I also, like there's the Soviet magical realism tradition of like Master and Margarita or something, where like these fantastical elements are being brought in with these very like mundane, everyday type of storylines. And I just like love I that's like the stuff I grew up on, and I really loved like that sort of approach to the fantastical where it's just like very matter of factly part of the story. Um I guess it is like technically a ghost story, which is funny because it's like it's not how I would necessarily categorize it, but it is literally a story about a ghost. So I guess it's that, I guess it has to be a ghost story. But I never really think of like magical elements as any different than non-magical elements, I guess. But it is a way to make it feel, I think, like alive.
So you said you took mediumship. Is it mediumship classes or how to be a medium? You took classes on this?
I took both like psychic meditation classes at this place in North Hollywood called Den Meditation, which were in person. This was before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, I took these mediumship classes that were like over Zoom.
But okay, because like I think in my very limited understanding of this stuff, to be a psychic or some kind of medium is something you're just sort of born with. It's not like a skill that can be cultivated. But it would seem that this is not the case. I mean, did you have any learning curve where you feel like you sharpened your psychic skills?
Well, I feel like when you're writing, you're basically channeling stuff, and that's not that different than psychic medium, than mediumship, I think. I mean, I'm not I feel okay, I have a couple thoughts. One, like I remember talking to my friend who came from like a family where a lot of messed up stuff happened, and she was talking about how like everybody with that sort of inherited trauma is a little bit psychic because you just are like hyper because of that hypervigilance, I guess, because you have to be so attuned to other people to survive. You learn to pick up on these things from your surroundings that people who don't need to do that and who are probably like healthier don't need to don't need to have that like awareness in order to feel safe, or to feel connected to people. So I don't know, I do think like there's some of that like where everybody probably has these capacities that are brought out in them depending on like the circumstances of their life probably. But I think like there's varying people have varying abilities in this way. And I don't know like what is psychic like, and I think also it's something that shifts through time and depending on like the people that you're trying to sort of have this psychic connection with. Like as a kid when I was very close to my mom, for example, I feel like, you know after like moving away, I could like wake up in the middle of the night and like she would be, like I felt so connected to her. Like there was like we could communicate without speaking like across large distances almost. But after like kind of growing up and like, you know, becoming more like of a separate person, you know, that was lost to some extent. But I feel like, or if like something terrible happens, like often I will just feel it and know, you know, before I get the phone call. It's like usually a feeling that I can anticipate, but you know, not always. And also, if you're just like in a constant state of terror, then you can always be anticipating things
Yeah.
accurately, I
You're
guess.
like, I'm always feeling like something horrible has just happened.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I guess I'm working on not feeling so.
Well, good luck. Good luck in this world, right? I mean, it's like a pretty hard world to not have that feeling in these days. But I guess a question would be like, have you ever? I understand like feeling like you can communicate with somebody even when they're not there, but that's different than I think like channeling a ghost or having contact with somebody who's passed away. Have you ever had an experience like that? Because I feel like this is a theme that's carried over from your first book into this book is ghost stories, family drama, mother-daughter relationships, but specifically with the supernatural. Is this something that you have an experience with?
Yeah, I have been visited in dreams by people who have died. Um, and it feels very different than like dreaming about them, which I've also had dreams about them, but like these visits that I've had, it's just a handful. Um, were like experience we're probably the closest. I've never like been awake and seen a ghost or anything like that. Um, but the visits I've had, and then I had like a weird experience of, I guess, maybe astral projection when I was on the other side of the country and my dog died. I just suddenly was like seeing the world through him. I don't know. It was very strange. I don't really even know how to describe it, but that's probably like, those are the only sort of like supernatural type of things that I've experienced. And I feel like with a dream, it's kind of easy enough to be like, well, it's just a dream, you know? But I don't know. It's like one of those things where it's like hard to, when you actually experience it, you don't really like require any sort of faith. It's like, I know that it wasn't just a dream, that these people were visiting me, but, um, you know, someone else believing that, it's like they didn't experience it. So, you know, I
Okay,
don't know.
but how did the visitation in the dream differentiate itself from just like dreaming about somebody? Like they show up and they just start like telling you they're here to visit you, or do you know what I'm saying? Like what was the actual content?
So one dream I had was my paternal grandfather. He just was in the dream. He didn't do anything. I just felt his presence there, and it was like very comforting. Um, it was just like a very, I woke up just feeling really happy to have just been with him. And it was like, there was no kind of verbal component to it. The other time, my grandfather, who I was very close with, who I grew up like in the same house with, um, my maternal grandfather, he died during the pandemic, and I was with him. I was actually recording his memoirs in his like last days in the hospital. He was just like dictating them into a tape recorder for, that was like his kind of his last like interactions with me. Um, and he died, and at the time actually I was taking these mediumship classes, and I remember it like really switched for me because it went from being this sort of like, oh, this is like a fun thing I'm doing, this is sort of like interesting to try to contact the dead, to feeling like, oh, I really desperately want to talk to somebody very specific. And so when the teacher started saying things like, because she would sort of channel people, and she'd be like, oh, it's an older man and he's saying something about his socks. And I remember being like, oh, I just put my grandfather's socks on him and he just died. Like, but it felt so fake, you know, like it felt very clear to me, like that it was not, it didn't feel real. And I was so aware of the fact that like I wanted it to be real. And like the difference between those two things like was, there's just like this gap of like not feeling like, not believing it and wanting to believe it, and being like, oh, maybe I can bend it to make it believable to myself, felt really like gross to me. And so I kind of stepped away from it. And then months later, I was complaining about how my grandfather never, like, I didn't really feel his presence at all. And he didn't like visit me, he never visited me. I was just complaining about that to someone. And that night, his voice just appeared in my ear and he just said my name. And I immediately woke up. And I felt just scared and like not ready at all for whatever that was going to be.
It's as you're saying this, I'm thinking of an interview that I listened to not too long ago with the actor Mark Ruffalo. Do you know this guy?
Yeah.
And have you heard the story about how early in his career, like just as his star was beginning to rise, so he was probably in his early 30s, and he had just done that Kenneth Lonergan movie. I think it's called You Can Count on Me, like a great
Mhm.
performance, great movie. But it was just like he was sort of the belle of the ball, and his acting career was just starting to take off after like a decade in the wilderness. And then he was on the set of a film, doing his next job or whatever. And he was sleeping and he had a dream. And this voice, like clear as a bell in his dream, was like, "You have a brain tumor." And he woke up and he was so disturbed by it that he literally went to the onset doctor and he was like, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I had a dream last night." He tells this doctor the story. And I think because he's a movie star, they indulged him. You know what I'm saying? And the doctor's like, "You know what? We're going to set your mind at ease. We're going to take you to the hospital. We'll get you a CAT scan." And they take him to the hospital and he gets a CAT scan and he's got like an egg-sized benign tumor growing behind one of his ears, requiring an emergency removal that could have left half of his face paralyzed,
Oh my
uh,
God.
or more likely caused him to lose hearing in the ear behind which the tumor resided. He lost hearing in that ear, but his doctor, his surgeon, was able to do it without losing his face, which would have probably ended his acting career. Like that shit gives me the chills. Like, how do you possibly explain that? And like what? Like, and then I think from his perspective, like he's got to be going through life feeling like someone's looking out for him or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, just a wild story.
Yeah. I think like there's something also you said that it sounded like a voice in his ear. Was that how he described it?
I
Yeah,
mean,
like
he heard a voice in his dream say, like, "You
right.
have a brain tumor," like clear as day.
Yeah. That's I don't know. I mean, I feel like we know so many things without consciously knowing them. Um and a lot of it is just about like bringing those things that we know into consciousness.
Yeah, it's fucking crazy. So you've studied psychic mediumship. I'm sure you probably visited a psychic or two in your life. Have you done that?
I have, but I've never had like anything really super transformative happen when I've talked to a psychic. It's always felt like just kind of like they're saying things that make sense and are just like, I guess, helpful in the sense that they're just kind of generally helpful. But I've never had like an experience that was like particularly like, ooh, chills.
Yeah, I've been a couple times. I actually had a psychic get some stuff pretty right, but also get some stuff like pretty wrong. So feels like it's kind of a mixed bag. But I want to get to the way that this novel is set up structurally, because you mentioned it in passing earlier about the title Mother Doll, which is alluding to the Matryoshka dolls, the Russian nesting dolls. And this is a theme in the book. I think it's also like part of the structural conceit of the book. First of all, is that accurate? Is that how you conceive of it? And if so, I'm curious to know when the idea for that structure came to you. If it is something you started with and built the novel out of, or if it's something that you applied to the book in revision as you went.
So I kept seeing this image everywhere I was going for a while when I was just starting writing that like really resonated with me. And it was sort of like a portal. Like it was like rectangles nested within each other going into like the center sort of. And it would be weird. Like I would see it as graffiti, I would see it as sculptures. I like I was just noticing it everywhere, and that was like, I mean, and that's really similar to like a nesting doll kind of structure. So yeah, I think that came early. I wanted that feeling of like a portal or things nesting within themselves, um, of like generations nesting within a person, you know? Um, Zhenya's body is like literally when she's pregnant, like holding another person inside of her. And then also she's like possessed by a ghost at one point, so she's like going backwards and going forwards in time, like both are contained within her. Um, so I was thinking about that kind of consciously. I didn't at all think about it as a like a Russian doll, a nesting doll, a matryoshka at all. Like, even though that's like exactly what I'm describing. And it wasn't the title of my book. Like, it was actually the title of my book came at the end, and it was suggested to me by my agent. And it was just like, duh. Like, after he said it, it was like, of course, like, it's so funny the way things are just like subconsciously there without you even realizing it so much of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the perfect title for the book. But it also makes sense to me that it would be something that wasn't super explicit to you, but was somehow embedded in you, similar to this issue of epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. Like some of this stuff is just in there, and then it takes your agent to sort of make you realize what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's so helpful to have like an outside smart perspective, to see you clearly sometimes because it's hard to see yourself, especially when you're just like in the middle of something. It's just hard to see what you're making a lot of times until after you've made it.
And what of this particular humor? I guess it's a Russian humor that is in your book. I couldn't help but be struck by it because it's just unique. I don't read a lot of books that are funny in the way that your book is funny. And it should be said that this book is often very funny, but in a dark, blunt, uh, like what's the word? There's like body horror humor. It's just a specific thing. Is it a Russian thing? Is that how you would define it?
I mean, I do feel like there's like an immigrant bluntness or like a Soviet bluntness that's probably like at the heart of this. Yeah. I mean, I think definitely those are the roots of it. Yeah, it's funny to try to describe the book to people because I'm like, it's about intergenerational trauma, but it's funny. It's just like, it's kind of like a strange combination. But, humor is like also a coping mechanism. So it makes sense.
Well, I find that the depictions of sex in this book are often very blunt and in a certain way funny. Uh, like that struck me. And I think in particular, it was Irina, the great great grandmother, talking about her own sexuality to her great great granddaughter through a psychic medium. I mean, that's an absurd premise, but it's unique for a great great grandchild to have awareness, I think, of a great great grandmother's sexuality at that level of intimacy. I can't
Yeah,
help but wonder, knowing that you received the memoirs of your grandmother. You talked about how she could spend like entire passages on constipation, like the constipation of her son or whatever, but were there sections of the memoir that got into her sex life and her intimate life in a way that like struck you?
absolutely not. Like
Okay.
not even a little bit, not even like remotely at all. Yeah, my grandmother was pretty like buttoned up about that stuff. My paternal one. I don't know about my maternal one, but no. I mean, there's also this part where Zhenya finds her grandmother's letters and journals and stuff, and those are sexually explicit, and that like really weirds her out because her grandmother is like, a person she grew up with as her grandmother. So I think that felt very like jarring to see like someone to see that side of someone. um of like your grandparent is very like I think was very unsettling for her. But I feel like with Irina it was maybe less unsettling because it is just like so kind of it's like a ghost and the ghost is like a teenager. So I don't know. So it feels like it's not somebody who raised her. Um, but yeah, I mean, I do. I guess yeah, I'm like comfortable talking bluntly about it, but I definitely that's not thanks to my grandma. I can't like blame my grandmother for that.
Well, but it's good. It's great fodder for comedy, and it's great for the reader because it's so unusual and bracing, but yet totally human, right? I mean, this is the stuff that usually lives subsurface and it's in people's private lives, as it should be, but it's something we all share in common one way or another. And I could not help but be struck by it. And I think too of this book, the nesting dolls conceit and, theme, and of motherhood, which this book is very much about. And like, you mentioned earlier, I think that you have a child, or you mentioned in the acknowledgments, I kind of gleaned that you have a child. Was the experience of becoming a mother part of the genesis of this novel for you? I have to believe it would be.
Definitely. Yeah, my daughter is like almost 10 now, so it was a long time ago that I like gave birth and had a baby, but I think like when I don't know if it was when I was pregnant, but definitely like after giving birth, there became this like awareness of myself as like part of a chain of mothers, thinking about my mother, thinking about my grandmother. And then also when my daughter was like certain ages, I started remembering those ages in myself. Like when she was 3.5 and 4, that was the age that I was when I came to the US. And it was like thinking about like my immigration, it was something that growing up we didn't really talk about that much. It was just kind of this like painful thing, and everybody in my family just was like wanted to move forward. So I never really like processed it or really thought about it. And I would even say that I was like kind of hostile to the idea that it was at all traumatic. Like in high school, when people would write their like college essays, and like a lot of other Russian people I know would like write about their immigration. And I just thought, like, oh, like that it's such a cliche or something to like feel to talk about it, which is just so funny because then like as soon as I had a daughter and like was seeing her the age that I was at, I was like remembering how difficult it was, like it was just like a visceral memory that I could just feel physically, um of like being that age and just being like taken from everything that I knew. Like my family was split. It was just like a very difficult time. um, and yeah, and I feel like I could sort of reprocess it now as an adult through just having like a child that age.
When you say your family was split, do you mean that there were family members back in Russia?
Yeah, so my dad wasn't allowed to leave because he needed permission from his parents and they wouldn't give it to him. So he had to stay, and he did eventually come, but he didn't leave with us. And my mom and her parents and I left, and like we went through Italy and Austria, and then we moved to Boston. And my grandfather needed heart surgery, the grandfather that I was actually just talking about, who died during the pandemic. So he got heart surgery in like 1986 and, lived for like 30 years after that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Harrowing. And how long was the time between you and your mother's parents coming to Boston, and then eventually your father comes over as well?
It was actually less than a year. It wasn't that long, but I remember, like, I think my kind of first conscious memories are from around that time, like before he came. Because I remember, like, some of my earliest memories, I was probably like 3.5, something like that. And I remember just like my mom had described my dad to me, but I couldn't remember what he looked like anymore. And she had told me that he had a beard. And I remember like anytime we would see anyone with a beard, I would be like, is that him? Is that him? Is that him? So, and I remember that, that's like one of my probably earliest memories. Um, and then, so even though like it wasn't that much longer after that my dad came, it was kind of like at a formative time.
Yeah, I mean 3.5, and you're separated from a parent for a long time. That'll mark you, right? I mean, you'll feel that. It's not like you weren't like a baby. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're an infant or something, or you're under the age of 1, probably not going to make as big of an impression. But at 3.5, like I'm trying to remember my kids at that age, but I think I really liked 2 and 3 because it's sort of like this in between stage, in between like baby and full person. So they're like all the cuteness of a baby, but with like some language and like being like ambulatory or whatever.
Yeah, it's definitely like an age that when my daughter was that age, I was like, "Oh, this is really difficult." But when I see like videos of her from that age, I'm just like, "Oh my God, she was so cute." But I think when
I
they're like defying you constantly, it's like hard to be like, "Oh, this is so cute."
right. I got to say, I remember 2 fondly. Maybe I'm just like rose colored glasses, but I think I had always been trained to believe like in the terrible twos or whatever. But like, I thought 2 was adorable. I liked it. So I want to ask you about the Russian Revolution a bit more. You mentioned earlier that you had to do research into it, which makes sense because you are writing into that time period. There is a historical fiction element to these recollections that you put on the page, vis-a-vis Irina, the great great grandmother character, who is speaking from the hereafter to Xenia. And I could not help but be struck by, and I noticed that this was echoed in one of the reviews I read of your book, uh, was on the page how contemporary seeming the Russian Revolution felt in a way that's kind of unnerving. I'm wondering if you felt that as you were doing research and writing those passages. Were you seeing resonances between the Russian Revolution and the times we live in now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to write about this time period for that reason, really. And it, I mean, actually, when I read a lot of research from that time period, it felt pretty contemporary also, strangely. I feel like I don't really read that much historical fiction, and I was reading a lot of just fiction that was written at the time of the revolution, or like right around then. Not so much like stuff that was written now about that time period, but like there was just this sense of this huge shift and this massive dissatisfaction that people were feeling with very good reason. And then there was also this like chaos, of because the revolution was followed by civil war for many years. And I think like when people think about the Russian Revolution, they think of like Bolsheviks, but there's so many different groups, and they all had kind of different aims. They all wanted the end of like the imperial government and the Tsar, but like beyond that, they were all pretty different. And after the Bolsheviks took over, like all those factions and other groups were driven underground. Most of them were killed. Some of them were able to like immigrate and escape, but like those groups were like particularly what I had been interested in. And I was reading a lot of like oral histories and journals and diaries and things like that from um, people from like the Mensheviks and the SRs and like all these other organizations that it's like hard not to think like, well, what would it have been like if one of those groups took over instead of the Bolsheviks? I mean, it's like, I guess, alternative history type of stuff. But
Well, I think one of the things that really hit me when I was reading was a line, and I'm going to be paraphrasing, where Irina talks about the aftermath of the revolution and how it was different, but it wasn't better.
well, my family came from the Soviet Union and we left there for a reason, so I don't think I have like very rosy colored glasses when I think about, the Soviet Union, which isn't to say that there are like certain aspects and certain ideals that I definitely admire. And I don't think that I don't think I would, I don't really know in terms of contemporary US, like I think it's it's scary and hard not to think about it because there's just a sense like starting from the before the pandemic and then during the pandemic of things just coming unglued, in a major way.
And I want to talk with you about craft, and just the process that you went through to get this book done. You mentioned that you were a new mother, I think, when the book was kind of coming to you. That's such a demanding job in its own right. And I think everyone who writes books who has kids has to find a way to do it. Can you just talk a little bit about the learning curve for you as you adapted to motherhood and then also tried to get your sophomore novel done?
Yeah, so when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was like in the middle of writing my first book. And I remember thinking like, okay, if I don't finish this while I'm pregnant, that's it. Cause like I'm never going to be able to write once she's born. And I was like very sick during my pregnancy. And so I was just like nauseous all the time and had brain fog, and I just like did not get much done at all, and I just thought like, well, that's it, you know. And then she was born and I felt a lot better, and then I also got like an Elizabeth George grant, which allowed for me to pay for childcare. And then and then I finished the book and it was totally fine. And I had like created all this drama around like this idea that like once I have a child, it's like over. And then it was like, no, it's not over. This is fine. Like obviously it takes a lot of time to have a child and like a lot of emotional energy. Um, so I don't want to like dismiss it as like not being difficult or something to balance with like creative work, because it can be, especially like the way that I like to work, which is I like to start really big projects like at residencies, and then I also like to do like big revisions at residencies because it's kind of like a push that I need to kind of get something off the ground, and then once I'm actually in it, I can just kind of maintain it within my life and it's okay. But like for that initial kind of push, it's really helpful to like go somewhere for a week or 2 weeks. And I have a partner who um also, does childcare. So we've figured out a way to make that work um for us. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's kind of I wrote this book mostly during the pandemic, and that sucked for parents and non-parents alike. That was like really difficult. But my daughter did end up going to this like outdoor school for like this, because in LA schools were closed for they closed like in the middle of her kindergarten and then all through her first grade. So for first grade she went to this outdoor school, which was great. It was just amazing. And it also like gave me time to work. So I really like did most of the actual writing during the pandemic, like during like that year, really. Though I had done like a bunch of, I started it like sort of the year before the pandemic in like 2019 at a residency, but um, most of the actual writing got done in this very room.
Oh, really?
Like hiding from everybody. Yeah, even though this isn't even my office, but
So when you talk, I want to ask a question about the residency thing. That's interesting. That makes some good sense that you would get a project off the ground in a concentrated push over a week or two at a residency, and that you would also undertake a significant revision or, subsequent draft at a residency. When you are starting a project and you go off to a residency, let's say you're there for 2 weeks, how much of the book or how much of a rough draft do you emerge with?
not much probably. I mean, it's more just like a feeling, like a sense of a shape maybe for a book, like structurally, or like a sense of who these characters are. Like I do a lot of just like kind of journaling, pre-writing type of stuff before I'm doing the actual writing. And I think it's just that kind of stuff of like figuring out like what is the story even, what are the relationships, what is this really about. um and then so I don't even think at that first residency, I think I was in Virginia at VCCA. And I mean, I filled journals with like just notes. I tried to write in like the voices of the different characters. I didn't know if it was going to be like first person or third person, though I think I had like kind of an idea like, oh, this is going to be a third person novel, which like is different from my first novel, which was first person, and usually all my short stories are in first person too. So it was like kind of like a new thing that I wanted to try. I had this sort of idea like about writing where I wanted to have that sense of remove. I also kind of like the kind of 19th century novel type of reference of a third, of an omniscient third person narrator. So anyway, like thinking about all those sort of craft elements that go into like the sort of writing, I was kind of putting those into place. But I don't think there was much that I wrote that is like in the actual book necessarily. And then I will say too, like another sort of craft thing that I did was I was doing a lot of research like before I even started the book. And like I did not know much about the Russian Revolution going into this. Like it took a lot of research before and I started writing, and it sort of became clear to me like I could research endlessly. Like I'm never going to be an expert in this. I could just keep researching forever as like a procrasta researching type of thing. And so then I really made.
Is that an actual term? Procrasta researching? It should be.
I've heard of it. Yeah, I've heard of it as a term, and it's definitely a phenomenon in my life. So I think once I kind of had enough of sort of just like a general base and kind of knew the direction that I wanted to go into, I really made a point of researching alongside writing. And it was so helpful in terms of like getting into like a kind of flow state. It was, um, it was great. Like I feel like all the Irina sections just kind of flowed out of me in a very like like channeled transmission type of way, because I think the research really helped with that.
But doing the research simultaneously with the drafting.
Exactly.
That's the key point. You were like toggling over to, whatever it is, a website or a book that you're reading about the Russian Revolution, and then toggling back to your manuscript and like in real time, even like adding bits and pieces from your research into the novel.
Kind of like I think I would just be like reading for an hour of like somebody's oral history or whatever. I might take some notes if there are like underline stuff that seems like details that could be relevant, and then I would just like sit down and write. And it wouldn't be like exactly the same type of thing necessarily, but just it would get me kind of into the headspace of that time period, of the concerns of like that world, and then it was just easy to just wade into it, the water didn't feel so cold, I guess.
So I'm going to read a quote from you. I think this is in a past interview where you say, quote, "To write, I need long stretches of quiet time alone. I need time to read and stare at nothing. I am always in awe of people who can integrate work into the chaos of life. I can't. And when I am in the middle of something, it's hard for me to switch gears, to take care of life stuff." Then you also say, "I am also very slow and very impatient, which is not the best combination." So fair enough, totally relatable. But I think this might have been said prior to you having a child, or maybe not. I'm just wondering, like, how does that square with like motherhood? Because it's kind of impossible to get these long stretches, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's not ideal. I mean, I feel like there's what's ideal, and then there's just reality, and you just make the best of it, I guess. I mean, my daughter is in school, so like I do have some long stretches, Um, and I do these residencies, but it's like I do a residency like every 2 years or something. It's not like I'm going on residencies every month. So I don't know. I think I definitely do need a lot of time to just get into kind of a dreamy state. And I will say that like technology and phones especially are definitely the opposite of getting into that dreamy state. So like if I can just keep my phone in the other room for 2 hours, I feel like that is like victory.
yeah, phones are the devil. The
Yeah.
internet, all of it, social media, it's bad. I don't think it's net positive. I really don't. Maybe the internet is, but I mean, just I'm speaking as somebody who checks his social media way too much. Like when you go on these residencies, do you unplug?
Yes. A lot of them, like, just don't even have internet, or, like, you'll have to, like, walk up to the top of a hill to use your cell phone or something like that, or to, like, use the internet in, like, their library or something. So it's not, like, so removed that that you can't be contacted. Because, like, I have a kid, so I don't feel comfortable just, like, being completely out of touch, but it definitely, like, just makes it more difficult, to get on the internet, and that helps me. I mean, I know there's lots of people who use the internet as, like, part of their process, and, like, God bless them, but it is not a helpful part of my process.
Yeah, I get that. I think I had a week last year where I totally detoxed from like I had no screens for a week, no TV, no phone, no computer. It made a marked difference. Like it all came flooding back in the second I went back to, life. So it's
Yeah.
not like it made some permanent shift, but like the amount of psychic space that it freed up in a week alone was noticeable, like
Yeah, I
really
can't
significant.
imagine. I feel like, honestly, like, just an hour of not having it, I'm like, "Oh my god, I have my brain back." It's not, like, colonized anymore, but, um, yeah, it's very addictive, so it's hard to do.
It's hard. Yeah. It's like, you have to live. You can't like live. And it's hard to live in the world in the absence of these things, which I think is that's sort of the point, right? Of these companies. They want it to be impossible to do without their services and products and everything. But I don't know if it's good for us. Um, I want to ask you a little bit about your evolution as an artist and how you came to writing. I also read, and forgive me, I don't know if we talked about this the last time you were on the show, but I read that you did not grow up wanting to be a writer. Like this was not like a childhood ambition, and that you actually in college started out taking photographs and staging these kinds of absurd, like elaborate scenes and getting your friends to sort of participate as your subjects slash what, like dramatis personae or whatever.
Yeah.
And then at some point, like realize that you could achieve something similar in writing and, you know, creating narrative that you were trying to do with photos, but it was just logistically simpler, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, is that accurate? Like that was how it sort of evolved for you?
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. My mom is, like, a ceramicist, and I almost went to art school, actually, for photography. And then when I went to Columbia for undergrad, I was, like, in the photography program, but yeah, it was, like, cumbersome. Like, all the things I wanted to do, it was kind of more like these film still type of things. And I think I was also interested in, like, maybe being a filmmaker, but, like, it just seemed so, like, it had so many moving parts and required so much stuff that writing just was so much simpler. And I was like, "Oh, I'll do that. That's easier." And then, it was definitely not easier in some ways, but, it was easier in terms of, like, I could do it myself. I didn't need anyone else's permission. I didn't need anyone else's money. I could just, write what I wanted to write. Um, so that was, like, pretty freeing. But I definitely still have the photos that I took of, like, all my cooperative college friends, um, hanging up on my walls of my house.
Oh,
There's,
they
like, my
are. You,
my friend is, like, covered in pencil shavings in one, and then, like, I don't know, I mean, it's, like, a lot of weird stuff, like people climbing out of, suitcases. I don't know.
so your first book, your debut, The Deeper the Water, the Uglier the Fish. That's right.
Yep.
It had a good bit of success. It was nominated, I think, for the LA Times Book Prize and was published in a variety of different countries and all this stuff. So a good debut. And now here you are uh, publishing your follow up. I just talked with Tommy Orange about this because he's publishing his sophomore novel. What was the experience like for you? Was it harder to write this second book than it was to write the first? Was it the same? Like, what was the process?
You know, I feel like the sort of story around sophomore novels that I hear, especially when they're like successful first novels, is there's like all this pressure and people feel like, oh, is this, how does this going to compare to the other one? I don't know. I didn't feel any of that. I just had like kind of a very clear vision with this book and a very clear sense of what I wanted. Um, and it's very different from my first book. So I feel like all of that kind of anxiety, like I didn't have it during the writing of the second book, but like I guess my book isn't out yet. It's coming out March 12th. So this is like the week before. So I don't know, I don't know how it's gonna land. I don't know. I mean, it's like easy to feel, nervous and excited and all of those feelings. But I think I'm always excited when I read something by a writer and it's not like the exact same thing as their first book. So hopefully people will also feel that way. But I think it's definitely like an anxiety to think about, like, um, yeah, just those comparisons and things like that.
You have to sort of flip the switch or find a way to shut that stuff out, at least when you're writing, right? You can't write and entertain those sorts of anxieties at the same time. Or if you do, it's probably going to muck up the process.
Yeah, I think that can be pretty paralyzing. I think because I was writing this during the pandemic and the world was just like, just so strange. It didn't really enter, it made it in some ways maybe easier. I don't know, because I wasn't having those types of, like, nothing was normal. I wasn't having those types of thoughts. Um, Everything was just kind of like isolated. It felt like a lifeline in a lot of ways and like an obsession and like a thing to put all of my energy into so that I wouldn't go nuts.
Yeah. I mean, I had that experience as a writer during the pandemic, and I'm now in a cycle where I'm talking to writers who almost exclusively composed the book in question that we're talking about during the pandemic just because of the publication, calendar. And
Right.
it's just interesting the ways in which the pandemic experience filters itself into the fiction. And I can sort of see how it's nothing really explicit in this book. There's no like references to the pandemic that I can recall, right? I don't think there is.
No, because so Zhenya's storyline takes place in 2008. So it's like pre-pandemic and it's also
Right.
pre-Trump. But I will say that, like, looking back, there's these descriptions of these like of the afterlife. There's just like these clouds of disembodied voices who are like grief. And now that I look back on it, I'm like, oh, that's totally inspired probably by all of the Zoom meetings I was on with just like all these disembodied voices talking at the same time, talking over each other, just like
Yeah.
the wonky internet, all of that stuff. I think like ended up kind of influencing the way I describe them.
That makes sense. Like Zoom cocktail parties as a grief cloud.
Yeah,
Like, I
exactly.
mean, I can see the crossover. I did not, but once the entire pandemic, I had one Zoom party that I attended. I couldn't do it. I was like, I'll talk to you when this is over. But just the Zooming, I can't do. Like sitting there with a cocktail and everybody's kind of cross talking. It was hard. I found, but I guess for certain people, it was the lifeline that they needed to just have some contact.
Yeah, I mean, it was so for people, I think with kids, it was like overwhelmingly. I mean, it was isolating socially, but like you also you weren't like alone. But I think for some people, they were alone, and that was hard in its own way.
Yeah. Well, I always ask people if they're working on anything else. It's kind of a cruel question, just as you're celebrating the publication of this one. But are you like a chain smoker? Do you always have something in the works? I know you do some screenwriting too, but like, what else are you working on, if anything?
Yeah, I'm like in very early stages with another book. I like have the sort of a feeling about it, which is sort of the first step. And I kind of have these like touch points, things that I think I know what it will be about, but it is very early. Like I don't have a draft or anything like that. And then I'm
And
working
you
on my
haven't done like the residency yet where you go and get it off the ground.
not yet. I'm, maybe this summer. Um, yeah, it's kind of hard like with book promotion. I'm also like working on some radio stuff, like radio drama stuff, like audio fiction. So,
For whom, may I ask? Or like, how does that work?
um, I feel like I don't know if I can talk about it or not. But I can tell you afterwards.
Okay. Top
Okay.
secret. All right. Well, it is great to talk with you, and congratulations on Mother Doll. It is a unique, like, work of art, and has a very cool and what's the word for it? Like blended sensibility. This kind of like very interesting collision between historical fiction and absurdist, like Soviet humor, if that's a way to put it, and like Russian magical realism. It's like all of these things sort of like wound together, and just congratulate you on seeing it through, and wish you all the best with it and with all that you have going.
Thank you so much, Brad. This was really fun.